My name is Scott Bertram from Hillsdale College, where I serve as the general manager of the student radio station there, WRFH, and also as a lecturer in journalism. You can also hear me hosting the college's national weekly radio show and podcast titled The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm joined today on this panel by Ann Rathborn Bradley and Ian Murray. We'll talk for about 45 minutes this afternoon on the topic of why socialism isn't the answer. Ann Rathborn Bradley is the George and Sally Meyer Fellow for Economic Education and the Academic Director at the Fund for American Studies. Previously, she worked as the Vice President of Economic Initiatives at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. She's a professor of economics at the Institute for World Politics in Grove City College and a visiting professor at George Mason University. She currently is an Acton Affiliate Scholar and a visiting scholar at the Barnard Center for Women, Politics, and Public Policy. Dr. Bradley is the co-editor and author of Counting the Cost, Christian Perspectives on Capitalism. For the least of these, a biblical answer to poverty, and Be Fruitful and Multiply, why economics is necessary for making God-pleasing decisions. And thank you so much for joining us.
Scott, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Ian Murray is the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Vice President of Strategy. For the past decade with the Institute, he's concentrated on financial regulation, trade, labor, and employment regulation, and free market environmentalism. He's published several acclaimed books, including The Socialist Temptation, Stealing You Blind, How Government Fat Cats Are Getting Rich Off of You, and The Really Inconvenient Truths, 7 Environmental Catastrophes Liberals Won't Tell You About Because They Helped Cause Them. Ian, thanks for joining us.
It's an absolute delight to be with you this afternoon.
We dig into this topic of why socialism isn't the answer, and I'll start with you, Ian. Why are we having this conversation today? It seems to be 30 years ago, we put the nail in the coffin of socialism as a viable form of an economy, and yet here we are. Did we not beat this back some time ago? Why are we still talking about it right now?
Well, it was one of the great champions of that victory, Ronald Reagan, who observed at Hillsdale College, I believe, in the late 1970s, that freedom is only ever one generation away from extinction. He, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul the Great won that battle a generation ago. But now I think it's our turn. There are many reasons why socialism keeps creeping back into the conversation. It tends to happen whenever people become dissatisfied with the current settlement. They start looking about for answers, and there are many reasons why socialism seems to give those answers. One of them is, Friedrich Hayek's thesis that we evolved to be cooperative in small groups. But I think the main one is that socialism appeals to us at the level of our values that underpin our politics. We want America to be a fairer place. We look around and see it isn't fair. Socialism says it can do that. We want America to be a place where community is valued. Socialism says it can do that too. Even when we say we want there to be more freedom in America, socialism says it can free us from the oppressive overlords who exploit us. Meanwhile, those of us who support the free enterprise system forgot how to do that, forgot how to talk at the level of our values. And as a result, socialism is there in the political discourse once again.
And if there is somewhat of an education issue here, what is the truth about socialism? What should people know that perhaps they're not being taught or they're not being reminded of?
This is such an important question because I think we mischaracterize these terms when we use the term socialism and when we use the term capitalism. And so to me, understanding the very basic principles behind these words is essential if we're ever going to have a real conversation. And as Ian says, if we can ever stop going back to this idea as people get agitated and they see things that are right to be upset about in terms of inequality or unfairness of things like this. So, I think part of it is just to understand how socialism works, which it literally means the government ownership of the means of production. So it is collective decision making. And if there is ever a time when you're going to engage in collective decision making, then you have to appoint someone or some group of people to make those decisions. Capitalism, on the other hand, is the private ownership of the means of production, which means that the decision-making process over scarce resources is decentralized. And so private individuals through private property make these decisions. And so I think what we need to do through our educational process is to look at both systems, and of course, then you can have mixed economies, which is what most of us live in, and say, which one is better able to do the things that we want, which is to give people at the bottom of the income distribution a better chance, income mobility, the possibility to kind of live into their dreams and do what they want. I mean, nobody argues against that stuff, right? We all want people to have opportunities. We all want people to live into their own dreams and desires. And so what I think we need to do as we educate people is be winsome about this as well, and not, I think the numbers are absolutely on our side, and maybe we'll get into that later, but I think we need to talk from the heart about the human person and what system really emboldens and empowers the human person to live into who they're supposed to be. And so, I think socialism cannot do that. And so we, as Ian says, we need to be very loud, I think, about this, because I think there's some kind of this dangerous romanticism about maybe we can modify socialism and get what we want.
Ian, I want to ask one more sort of large-scale question before digging into some details here, and that's this. Every time this conversation comes up, we hear the argument that real socialism has never been tried. In Cuba, in Venezuela, across the world, somehow real socialism never has been tried anywhere. Is that anywhere close to being the truth, Ian?
Yes, I'm indebted to a colleague at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, Dr. Christian Niemitz, for pointing out something that I think is fundamental to this question, which is that every single time, a system that calls itself socialist has been set up, there's a sort of three-stage process that it goes through. The first stage is the new dawn is here. The International Brotherhood of Man is upon us. Real socialism is going to be tried at last. All the commentators say this. They talk about how wonderful the new system is and how this is it. This is it here at last. But after a few years, the second part of the process starts to occur. The wheels start to come off. There are inherent contradictions in economic contradictions in socialism, social contradictions in socialism, that lead to things not working out quite as well as they should be. So that's when those same commentators turn around and say, well, this can't be the fault of socialism. Socialism is perfect. So it has to be the fault of wreckers or saboteurs or often foreign interference, the CIA or something like that. At which point, I think that's the point that we're at with Venezuela at the moment. Every good socialist worth his or her salt will tell you that Venezuela would be fine were it not for the foreign interference in the CIA. And then finally, when everything has gone to heck in a handbasket, when in the worst cases there may be many, many thousands of dead, those same commentators who hailed the dawn of the new era turn around and say, well, no, that wasn't real socialism. So in every single instance, Christian has documented this, in every single instance, this process occurs. So what this process does is it gives socialism a get-out-of-jail-free card. You can never pin the horrors of the past on socialism if that third part, if we let that third part happen, if we let them get away with saying that it's that real socialism has never been tried. So what we have to do is every time a socialist lays out a policy, we can go back, we can look at how that policy has been used in previous instances of socialist experiments, and we can point to the very real disasters that occurred as a result of it. We can't let them get away with this idea that real socialism has never been tried.
And we have a question from part of our live audience watching us this afternoon. As we sort of speak of a definition of what we're discussing here today, What about those Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden? We hear a lot of comparisons on the left and those who are talking about some of the socialist policies, saying they work here, they're democratic socialist countries, a kind of socialism light. Are those correct definitions to use when we're thinking and talking about those countries?
Absolutely not. I think that we just need to stop that right, right at the front where it starts. I think it is just a mischaracterization to look at a country like Sweden or Denmark or Finland, what we call the Nordic countries. We talk about the Nordic model of economics, and to describe it as democratic socialism. So again, going back to what I said before, socialism is collective ownership of the means of production, which requires boards of technocrats, and they make resource allocation decisions. And then it has to be compulsory. So they have to have some method of force. So they say, you know, you're going to be in agriculture, you're going to be in engineering, et cetera, et cetera. And then they make it happen. And so if you look at those countries, and I think it's very helpful to look at economic freedom and the economic freedom indices, because that helps us measure the type of institutional setting that these countries have. And these countries score at the top of the economic freedom index. Now, there are small countries that have a lot of redistribution. And we can have a conversation. You know, they're social democracies, one might say. So we can have a conversation about whether that's a good idea or not a good idea. Is that going to get us more human flourishing, more wealth accumulation, more entrepreneurship or not? That, I believe, is a different question than are those examples of modern socialism that the United States or other countries should replicate. They are just not socialist economies. And really, I think that using that terminology and ascribing it to those countries is very damaging, because again, I think it confuses people about what socialism is and what socialism requires. So to say we should be more like Denmark is not to say we should be more socialist. So we really have to unpack, you know, kind of what's going on in those countries. But no, I don't think that's appropriate as a characterization.
Ian, there's this illusion, I think, at times that socialism is inherently democratic, that it is of the people. But in execution, as Anne just pointed out, there needs to be this series of bureaucrats to make these decisions, to carry them out, to use force to carry out those policies. Is there any way around that in socialism?
Well, I don't think there is. One of the most important parts of democratic socialism is the idea that the entire economy is under the control of the people. It just takes a moment thought to realize that the people cannot decide on every aspect of the economy, all the millions of transactions that happen every day. So they have to delegate that power. Who do they delegate that power to? To bureaucrats, to commissars, to apparatchiks. These commissars eventually become, actually very, very quickly become, a new ruling class. And so the very idea that socialism can be democratic is just gainsaid by the way socialism has to work in practice. It becomes, at the very least, bureaucratic socialism, but very often becomes just another hierarchical society where people are told what to do by their betters. That's why I think that everybody who's interested in socialism, if they haven't done so already, should read George Orwell's great allegory, Animal Farm. Starts off with the wonderful idea the farmers have been got rid of, the animals create a new society under the simple slogan, all animals are equal. At the end, the pigs start walking on their hind legs, and that slogan becomes all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And that's the inherent contradiction of what they term democratic socialism.
And is there any aspect of socialism that actually attempts to raise up the poor, or is it simply a matter of bringing down the rich? Does socialism actually attempt to bring those people at the lower levels of society up?
Well, you know, I think that there's a difference between intentions and outcomes here. You know, to answer that question, you have to look at what do the socialists promise. Ian already appropriately mentioned modern day Venezuela, which is an economy we're seeing absolutely get destroyed in all of the institutions of society with it. And this is a place that 30 years ago you'd go to vacation, right? I mean, it's a place that was democratic and wealthy. And so I think that the intentions, the desired intentions of the people who wanted power were to elevate the poor. So I think that's what the socialist promise is to level the playing field. And as Ian mentioned before, when we see injustice in our society, I think it's right and good for us to agitate against that and to agitate for reform. The question we're having today is socialism going to do that? And really what socialism is very effective at doing is destroying people's wealth. And if you want equality of poverty, socialism will give that to you. With a lot of collateral damage. So hundreds of millions of people have died under this very vicious and dangerous experiment. So when I hear people kind of using the term lightly, saying, okay, we're just going to put the word democratic in front of it and everything's going to be okay, as Ian mentioned, it doesn't work that way because it doesn't function in that regard. It requires compulsion. And so somebody has to ramp up the force as we're going to ramp up the resource allocation at the highest level. So I think the outcome of socialism is the antithesis of what it promises. And that's a really important element of our understanding here.
Ian, we have a question from the audience. Just wrote a book called The Socialist Temptation. Is there any way to create a system that borrows from both socialism and capitalism? Is a mix possible, or is it like oil and water? Can they simply not mix?
I think when we look at Sweden today, that Anne was mentioning earlier, that's an example of somewhere where they've tried to do that. I think it's very important to recognize that when we think about Sweden, we recognize that it used to be a democratic socialist country. They did nationalize a lot of stuff, but then they moved away from that. In the 1970s and 80s, they realized that the extremely high rates of taxation and extreme regulation, plus the government ownership, was just killing innovation in that country. It was driving the talented people overseas. So they stepped back. They got rid of the oversight of the economy and kept a large welfare state. So that's where I think there is an attempt to do something like that. But even then, there are two things that you have to remember. The first is that very extensive welfare state comes at a very high price, which means that middle-class people, in the American term, middle-class people are paying extremely high tax rates to pay for the welfare state. When you listen to democratic socialists in America, you'd believe that we could get not just the welfare state, but nationalized industries and everything with only high taxations on the very rich. That's not possible. Sweden, Denmark, the rest seem to gainsay that. In Denmark, for instance, the taxation on a new car is double the price of the car, so 200% tax rate on the new car. So we've got to recognize that if you want to try and mix these two systems, then you are going to have to pay a very, very high cost in terms of taxation. The other thing is that if you look at Sweden and the way it is regulated, it is much less highly regulated in most circumstances than the United States. This is why Anne mentioned the indexes of economic freedom. Sweden does about as well as the United States most years, because it has, despite its very high taxation, it has very low regulation. School choice, for instance, was introduced into Sweden with the support of the teachers' unions. They have privatized part of their social security system. All of this sort of deregulation and the government getting out of the economy would seem to be anathema to America's democratic socialists. So even when you do try to mix the two systems, there are still implications that suggest that the sort of thing that American democratic socialists are talking about is completely different from the sort of thing that Sweden and Denmark and the rest have ended up with.
And I was watching a lecture of yours recently, and you had a great phrase. You said that we should be promoting a system that encourages the service of strangers, not the plunder. What is it about the free market that encourages the latter, or I'm sorry, the former, and what is it about socialism that encourages the latter?
Yeah, this is something I think we should talk about more as well. So the free market, I think the power in it, it's not magical, it's not a unicorn, it's not perfect. So we need to be very upfront about those things as well. I mean, these are institutions that are made up of people. That's both the great thing and the thing we need to be worried about. And so what the market economy does, and goes back to Smith, and I think this is why Smith has such an enduring legacy as an important thinker, especially in the early days of economics, is that he understood people as they are. And he said, we need to take people in society as they are, not as we want them to be. So we can't have benevolent altruists running around all the time. And, we can't have a policy or a leader that transforms people into something that they're incapable of being. But what Smith saw is that with the right set of institutions, you can induce, and he talked about kind of the ordinary man in his ordinary conduct. So not when you're having your best day ever, but when, you wake up on an ordinary day, what are your incentives? And you want to think about how to serve people around you, how to serve strangers. And so this happens through the seeds of entrepreneurship in a society with a lot of economic freedom. And what this means is that, the giants of industry actually have to care about their customers, and they have to problem solve and discover new ways of doing things. So those are incentives that are baked in to the system of a market economy. And so they take us ordinary people who have, we're fallen and we're sinners and we make a lot of mistakes and we're corruptible, but we take them and we induce them on net to do those things. Socialism has, again, it's all about incentives, has the opposite incentives. It's about, how to kind of be an insider in that system, because that's the way you're going to live large. That's the way you're going to protect yourself and hopefully your family, is to be a part of that big bureaucratic machine. Rather than how to wake up in the morning and say, hey, my neighbors are having, or my community, that we have these problems, we need solutions to them. I'm only going to get paid if I figure out how to do that. And I do that in the competition of other people. And so socialism just doesn't provide those incentives. In fact, it incentivizes the opposite. So plunder, exploitation are what we find to be typical in a socialist system, because it's the only way you can survive, right? So it's just establishing very different incentives.
We have a question from one of our viewers actually in Venezuela today, and I'll open this up to both of you. I'll start with Ian. We take a real world example here, Ian, of a rich country, an oil-rich country, certainly in Venezuela, where socialism has entered. How specifically, perhaps in this real world example, has socialism negatively affected Venezuela from an economic perspective, from a cultural perspective, from a religious perspective?
Well, I think even more fundamentally than that, it affects people at a subsistence level. Venezuela went down a road that the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, others went down, which is the complete and utter abrogation of property rights and the collectivization of land. As soon as you do that, you interfere with the way that we get food. So in Venezuela now, they talk about the Maduro diet, because people are so literally starved of basic subsistence items that very bottom of the hierarchy of needs is under threat. As the British contrarian Toby Young puts it, socialism always starts with talk about the International Brotherhood of Man and ends up with you having to eat your own pets.
Anne?
Yeah, I think that those are great examples of how, I mean, they're tragic examples. So this is the other thing I would add to what Ian has just said, which is that Venezuela is a man-made tragedy that was wholly avoidable. And so this is why we have to get it right. So again, going back to economic freedom, decades ago, Venezuela was in the top, and it was in the top kind of third of all countries. But it was the top country in Latin America. And now, if you look at pretty much every index that measures this, they're in last place. That is a terrible accomplishment. And so what you see too is that, kind of you get this kind of mob rule. So you can't necessarily go to the grocery store even on your day when it's your turn and you have your ration ticket, because gangs and criminals are really running the streets. And so it's as if you live in a prison that you can't escape. And obviously, we see people that are trying desperately to leave. And they're doing that at great personal sacrifice, leaving their families in the hopes that they can, maybe send some money back or maybe help their families by doing this, but at great personal cost. And that, to me, I think is the extra layer of human tragedy here, is that, people will just continue to leave until things somehow improve. And so I think this man-made tragedy can be solved. I think we need to be optimistic about this. It doesn't have to go on forever, and the course can be reversed. But it has to be about, taking power from the powerful and realigning those institutions that used to be there.
Ian, free markets can be efficient. Are they fair, though? If a society decides that we want to try in a way to create more equal outcomes, which is going to be difficult today in a free and open society, of course. But if we say that's one of our goals, we want to have more fair or more equal outcomes, is the free market system still capable of pulling that off?
Well, I think it very much is. It's because free enterprise is essentially, if I could characterize a difference between the two, free enterprise is essentially based on trust, whereas socialism is based on suspicion. So in the free enterprise system, you presume that to use Adam Smith's phrase, you presume that the baker and the butcher that you are trading with are giving you good stuff. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, you have recourse to the law. In socialism, the implicit presumption is that the exchange will be exploited in some way, and that therefore you need guardians to protect you. Those guardians impose a tax in some way, whether it be time, money, or quality, often all three. And because of the this implicit presumption, trust in your fellow man is destroyed. And I think it's especially ironic that this happens to a system that is supposed to be based on the brotherhood of man. So free enterprise is about cooperation. And cooperation depends on fairness. If you aren't fair in your economic transactions, then the system starts to break down. So that's why we have the recourse to law. But at its most basic, free enterprise provides you with free and fair cooperation that leads to mutual benefit. Socialism, on the other hand, is all about that level of oversight, that level of bureaucracy, where most of the benefit accrues to the overseer, and it certainly accrues to the producer rather than the consumer. So fairness starts to break down in those situations, which is why I will always say that free enterprise is the best way to ensure a fair society.
And is there anything morally wrong with making a profit? Is free market economics consistent with a Christian perspective?
I believe it is. I think that key questions we have to ask is how in different societies do people earn a profit? And so that's the nuance that's very important. So as Ian was saying, in a market economy, we really have a very high level of trust that emerges over time, which is fascinating when you think about it, because you're always dealing with strangers. right? So when you go to the grocery store, just think about ordering something off of Amazon, like a toothbrush, right? You don't know where it came from, but you put it in your mouth and everything seems to work out, and it costs you under $2 or something. And so this is a marvel. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And so I think in a free market system, again, you have the incentives for people to trust each other. And the profit is made when you serve someone else and they voluntarily give up some of their income to get what you are promising them. And as Ian mentions, we have recourse through the rule of law, which is required for a free market system, such that if you are being ripped off or if the entrepreneur is being dishonest with you, then you have recourse. So again, we're never presuming in the market system that people are perfect or always honest, but rather that the system will mitigate the corruption. And so corruption is kept to, a bare minimum. And in socialism, you're not going to, you get a profit, again, by being a part of the system that exploits. And so I think that profit making, profit accumulation is very consistent with a Christian worldview if it's bounded by the rule of law, private property rights that are judicially enforced equally. So those are big caveats, but I think when you have those, then, Jeff Bezos has made a lot of money because he's figured out a way to get me the toothbrush in 2 days. And in a pandemic, that's great. I don't have to go to those stores. So this is, again, finding ways to serve other people. And I am voluntarily giving up my income. And the minute I stop doing that, then I'm sending Amazon or Whole Foods, whoever it is, a very powerful signal. And they have an incentive to care about my opinion. And I'm not a president. I'm not, a member of the political class. So that's the power that the consumer has. And so I think that is what legitimizes a wealth accumulation in a free society. And as Ian mentioned, it's available to more and more people. And that's the justice. That's the equality of a free market society, is that, the Jeff Bezoses can come from anywhere, not just from a certain class or a certain family, et cetera.
Ian, there's a question for one of our live viewers this afternoon about any institutions that might be better served by government control rather than private enterprise in a free market system, healthcare perhaps being an example. Is there anything like that that you can think of?
Well, I think the courts of law that we have just mentioned, and certain other of the institutions of liberty are very much not part of the economic transaction process. Having said that, when you look at things like healthcare, I come from the United Kingdom. We were a democratic socialist country. In my youth, I used to have to traipse around the gas board, for instance, while my parents were looking at having a new gas heating system installed. So we had to, because not just the means of production, but the means of distribution in the gas industry's case had been nationalized. So we had to go to the gas board showroom, be shown a very limited selection of products, and then wait months and months and months for the new heating system to be put in. Over the summer here, using the free enterprise system, I just called up a variety of salesmen and got a new system within 2 weeks. So that's the difference. The UK got rid of most of that nationalisation, but very notably did not in the area of healthcare. The healthcare in the UK is still completely government run. It's a huge suck on the nation's resources. And yet still, the United Kingdom spends about half as much per person on healthcare as the United States does. Healthcare is, because it is not available as part of a commercial exchange, it is rationed. So if you have an accident and need to go to the emergency room, you'll probably be dealt with very well. And that's a lot of people's experience with the health service, which is one of the reasons why the National Health Service is in such high regard in the UK. But as soon as you have any sort of chronic illness, you face this rationing problem. You will wait months and months and months, just as we did for the gas heating system in my youth. You will wait months and months and months for an operation. Many people just die before that operation it takes place. Quite often, you have a situation where the day for your operation comes around and you're cancelled, and you essentially have to go to the back of the queue. Once you reach a certain age, the powers that be in the health service say, no, it's not worth us you doing having the operation anymore. My mother had a hip replacement in her 60s. She is now in her 80s. She really needs a new hip replacement, but according to the health service, she's too old for that to happen. So even if you think that the provision of healthcare by a government body will be fairer, there are trade-offs. And those trade-offs often come in areas which, when you think about them, are probably unacceptable. So one thing to think about when it comes to healthcare is look at the National Health Service and look at the trade-offs that are involved.
And I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, you might, but we know over the past 30 years or so, certainly, extreme poverty across the globe has dropped tremendously. Why are we so focused, maybe not we here today, why are so many so focused on the intentions of socialism and not as focused on the actual results of the free market system?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we need to scream this from the mountaintops, because just the radical race out of poverty, in particular in the last 50 years, but if you look at the course of the last 250 years, it is remarkable. I mean, absolutely remarkable. Prior to 1750, there was no society that experienced long-term sustainable economic growth. So everybody across every society lived in the exact same way, and they lived short lives, very poor, very difficult lives. So lots of things have changed, and that has really accelerated over the last 50 years, I think, due to a lot of different factors. But one is the world is just more globalized right now. And so people are getting richer. People are doing better for their families, and they're living longer. And these are things to be celebrated. But when you talk to people, they actually believe the world is getting worse in terms of poverty. I see this also in my students. So if you survey them on this data, they just don't seem to know the trend. So I think that's part of it is we don't know the numbers. We just don't know what's happening. And I think, there's a lot of explanations for that, but there's this negativity bias. We're kind of drawn to the bad news. We're drawn to the things we should be worried about. And I think this is, there's still a lot of people that live in extreme poverty, far less than before, but there's work to do is what I'm saying. And it seems to be that with socialism, to the other part of your question, we kind of forget about all the bad stuff. We forget that there's 100 million people who died in the 20th century under very different country experiments with collectivization of economic resources. And we either forget the past. I think part of it is knowing our history and knowing the reasons for why those experiments will continually fail. And then holding people accountable who suggest we should have more of that, or we should try a different way, holding them accountable to those empirical outcomes that we know to be true. So, Ian mentioned one of my favorite people, F.A. Hayek, earlier, and he was really remarkable in the 20th century in his intellectual discourse that he had. So he kind of went back and forth with socialists and big government people, and he kind of really showed and demonstrated intellectually that socialism does not work. And because it doesn't have the mechanisms built in to correct the mistakes. So just going to what Ian was just speaking about with healthcare. I mean, what we start talking about in my classroom is just because the government can do something doesn't mean they should do it. Mm-hmm. So we need a way to figure out, well, what should the government do? And I think that economics provides us a lot of ways to think about that. Public goods, dealing with externalities, the rule of law, et cetera. But the government can certainly provide healthcare. It does in many countries. But that doesn't mean it should, and that doesn't mean it's a good idea. And so the question is always, if you have a country that's flirting with socialism, maybe they're doing well for a while. Maybe they still have, long lives and high relative incomes. But the question always is, if they change their institutions to be more market oriented, how much better would they do? And I think that's how we have to ask and answer these questions, right? Is to say, under different comparative institutional arrangements, whether is the market or the state going to be the better provider of whatever good or service we're talking about?
Ian, a question from a listener this afternoon from New York City. Is there a need to shift the conversation here, not so much about capitalism versus socialism, as much about caring or not caring for your neighbor? Certainly, charity is still functioning in a free market society. You are free to help those around you. Do we have to sort of twist the conversation toward that direction?
I think that's very much the case. I think what I was saying at the beginning about how socialism speaks to us at that level of values. That's exactly what the sort of thing I was talking about. When Anne was discussing the morality of making a profit, for instance, we need to show that there's a difference between love of money. I mean, the Bible says "radix malorum est cupiditas," that love of money is the root of all evil. That's got twisted through bad translations to money is the root of all evil, and so people associate making a profit with the root of all evil. But when you look at when you look at what sins the love of money provides for things like hoarding, sorry, I got a bit distracted there. But the difference is that the love of money and the profit motive aren't the same. So we need to start making those distinctions. We need to make the distinction that loving your fellow man and loving thyself both work together to produce that sort of cooperative system of trust that I was talking about at the beginning. We should be talking about loving thyself rather than selfishness. So there's a lot of things that we should really be doing when we talk about talk about the free enterprise system. We should not be talking about aggregate GDPs and things like that. We should be talking about how the free enterprise system works at that very individual, very neighborhoodly, connected level. And we haven't been doing that. And that's something that we have to get back to.
We have just a couple of more minutes left in this panel discussion. I'll ask one more question and give you both an opportunity to respond. If we look at the election results in this country from just a couple of weeks ago, the party that has been discussing many of these socialist policies, or at least flirting with some of these socialist policies, took some lumps in a lot of areas, and especially in areas where people have had experience, or their family has had experience with socialist economic regimes. We see members of that party saying, we can't get too close to these ideas. We're going to get killed again in 2022 if that happens. Are you encouraged by that development, or is this really just the beginning of this fight here in the United States? Anne, you first.
I'll take any encouragement I can get in American politics. So yes, I mean, I think that when we see voters walking away from these very radical ideas, we should be encouraged by that. But as Ian says, the way we step into that void is going to be very important. Mm-hmm. To be very strategic. I think, Ian, I just could not agree with you more. Nobody cares about GDP, and that's the best way to make people think you don't care about anything, and you're like, blockhead economist, is to start talking about people. It's too remote from their lives. And so we need to talk about opportunity. We need to talk about, the fact that our education system is broken and it disproportionately affects minorities and immigrants and people who are in the, kind of at the lower end of the income distribution. So how can we reform that? I think market economics provides some suggestions. And I think at a time like this, people might be more open to some of those suggestions. And so I think we need to proceed graciously into that void and not pounding the so-called enemy. But I am encouraged by that. I am encouraged by that. And I think, it's a tough time in American politics. So I think we need to proceed carefully, because if we're just viewed as, the opposite polar aside, just pounding the enemy, I really don't think that we're going to be able to make any traction out of what's on the table.
Ian, let me open this to you, but also perhaps add one more question, which is there anyone out there with a podium, with a megaphone, speaking about this issue in the right way, the way you'd like to see it discussed?
I really wish there was. I wish there was a Margaret Thatcher who, if you follow The Crown, you will see in the new series of The Crown, you'll see a portrayal of Margaret Thatcher where she talks about things at the as a housewife would talk about them. She reduces economics to the economics of the family, and she talks about virtues like thrift and saving, and she also talks about socialism in very moral terms as the politics of envy, and that's who I wish we had again. I wish we had a new Margaret Thatcher. One of the good things that I think that the election results have displayed is that we were worried that America was polarized into two blocks, progressives and conservative nationalists. I think the election has shown that there are probably more like four blocks in America. There's sort of new conservatives, immigrants, the people who fled socialism to come to Texas and to Florida. I think that they're a group who are open to free enterprise, and we should do our best to bring them to the cause. And I think there's many ways a sort of new liberal bloc, liberal in the classical sense of the term, who they'll vote in favor of a minimum wage, but they are very worried about identity politics and a resurrection of segregation from the left. So I think there are probably four parties in America, and if any group can get three of them, then I think they'll be set for a generation or so. But the great thing is that only one of those groups is socialist, and for that I am profoundly grateful.
Ian, Anne, thank you so much for your insight this afternoon and for joining us here for the Poverty Cure Summit. Thank you.